might have heard of resting bitch face. When I was younger, I used to suffer from resting sad face. Also, what I refer to now as resting fear face. It was this tendency that I had to, I guess, when I was feeling a very specific way, it would kind of show itself on my face. And I don't know, it looked like I was scared or miserable or just unhappy to be where I was. And my mom often scolded me for it and tell me not to make that face. The thing was, I was never really cognizant of that face or cognizant that I was making a face that was different than what my resting normal face was. And now as an adult, I realize that I hadn't yet had the vocabulary, but what I was experiencing was anxiety. So really, what it should have been called was my resting anxiety face. So that was kind of how my anxiety exhibited itself early on. I didn't know what it was. I just knew that it was a very specific feeling that I didn't yet have the words to describe, and no one else understood. And most of the time, that exhibited itself as social anxiety. So I always had a difficult time around other children. And there's a specific story in which my aunt, who I'm still very close with now, had taken me to the park in walking distance from where we were. I was sitting there in the sand playing with some toys, and she was sitting there not too far behind me, and a kid approached and asked if they could play. And at the time, I was almost kind of shocked into silence because I wasn't used to playing with other kids. I was an only child for a very long time, and I didn't know how to respond, so I turned to look at my aunt, and she kind of was like, yeah, of course, go ahead. And part of me was like, oh, why'd you say yes? And I remember just retreating into myself and literally pulling away and just watching as this kid that I had never met, never seen before, totally harmless, play with my toys in front of me. And they paid no mind to the fact that I wasn't engaging or interacting. They were just minding their own business. And I just felt extremely uncomfortable. I just remember feeling like I wanted to kind of shrink in on myself and hide away in a hole until the kid was done playing with my toys, then grab my toys and go home. And that experience was something that I felt repeatedly growing up. I went to preschool, and if my memory serves me right, I am pretty sure I used to kick and scream on the floor. Yeah, I was that dramatic kid. My parents can confirm. Because I could not stand the idea of being left in an unfamiliar place among unfamiliar children, which is not necessarily true because I saw these kids every single day. But still, it never felt like I ever became comfortable. Children were almost like, despite being the same age, like of a different breed. They're unpredictable. They're playful, they're comfortable, they're blunt, and that volatility, which I don't think is the exact word I'm looking for, was scary to me because I couldn't control, I couldn't predict, even at a young age, what would I really need to control and predict. But despite that, children made me uncomfortable, despite them being my age. My aunt has always kind of described me as an old soul. I've been told I've grown up fast, that I was very mature for my age. And I'm sure that's true in some regard because I had to take up more adult responsibilities at a younger age, like taking care of my siblings and being raised by immigrant, refugee, traditional grandparents. They expected me to, they have a lot of expectations for me, even as a young child. A larger part of that was anxiety. It was this feeling that I felt held me captive in my own little bubble that I didn't know how to describe, that no one else understood. And I had always just chalked that up to being a part of my personality, that I was just different from everyone else, that I wasn't normal, and that something was inherently wrong with me that made it so that I couldn't interact with kids the way that I was supposed to, like every other kid did. That I was uncomfortable in very normal situations, and that made me feel very much like an outsider, even within my own family, my own friend group, my own community. When I got to college, I still didn't really have a true understanding of my anxiety. I still didn't have any sort of diagnosis, proper understanding of how to cope with what I was experiencing. I still just thought, yeah, I'm just weird. I'm introverted, that's how I am. And it had led to several fallouts in college where I just didn't feel heard or understood. I've had friends at the time that didn't take the time to understand or try to understand where I was coming from or why I made certain actions or did the things that I did. And in reality, I always had the intention, like pure intentions, good intentions, and I've always been a huge people pleaser, so it was very frustrating to have gone through these pains to people please and do what I thought was best for someone else when the effort wasn't being reciprocated so that that person was understanding where I was coming from and how I felt in certain situations, because how I felt and how I reacted was different. What I didn't realize at the time was that I was a neurodivergent living in a very neurotypical world. So even until this day, there were very, very few people that I had connected truly with in college that I felt I could be my normal, anxious, normal, not neurotypical, anxious self around. And one of those was my previous partner. Fast forward to 2017, after I had just graduated from UCLA, I lost my grandfather, who was like a father to me, to stage 4 pancreatic cancer. And needless to say, it was the hardest thing I had ever experienced in my life, as it is for anyone to lose someone they love. But on top of his passing, I was staying at home in my childhood home with my grandmother every single day, and it felt like I didn't have any room to breathe from that grief, because I would see his belongings and see his clothes, and I would envision him sitting where he used to sit, doing the things that he used to do, and it was just so difficult to imagine this life now without him. And it had gotten to a point where waking up was a chore. Waking up every day and wanting to go back to sleep, because sleep was safer than being exposed to the thoughts that came up in my head on a daily basis. And it got to the point where I was irritable, I was lashing out at my partner, I was clearly depressed, and my grief had taken me to places where moments were wins. Just getting through a bad moment was a phenomenal win, because anything can happen in any single moment. It wasn't getting through the day, getting through the week. It was getting through the moment when things got really difficult. So at some point, my partner had told me that he thought I should seek help. And I didn't even know what that meant at first. But my answer was I didn't need it. Because at the time, I felt that if I were to seek help, that it meant that there was something wrong with me. And that it meant that I wasn't a strong person because I couldn't handle it on my own. And that all of the resilience that I had developed in light of my anxiety meant nothing if I were to just, make the phone call. A lot of that was intertwined with the stigma of asking for help and the stigma with mental health, and growing up in a Southeast Asian family where we don't ask for help. We don't talk about our feelings or emotions. There's a lot of repression, and this can be a whole other video and conversation, but a lot of that intertwined with my own fears made it really difficult to reach out. So my partner had even did the research and found a phone number. All I had to do was call. Then I didn't even know who it was, what this organization was, what I would ask for, what I would tell them. I kept the number for almost about a year. And I can't remember exactly what it was that had prompted me to finally call, but I think it had reached a point where I started to feel scared for my own well-being, for my own existence. And I thought that if I just continued the way that I did at the time, that I was not going to make it out alive. And that terrified me, because if anything, if it wasn't for myself, it was for my grandmother. She needed me because she just lost her husband, and I felt like I was the only one who was there, who was going to be there for her. So when I called, I quickly learned that the program was affiliated with the SCSU marriage and family therapy graduate program, I believe. And so my therapist or counselor was a graduate student who was studying to be a licensed therapist. And so he was still very inexperienced, and it was very apparent that he would sometimes fumble, and I was okay with that. I had never done counseling. Opening up was extremely hard. On top of that, I learned that we were being monitored. So one side of the room, though I couldn't see them, but there would be, I guess, preceptors, people who are already licensed therapists, watching and observing. And that was nerve-wracking, and it made it very, very difficult to be vulnerable. Another thing was that we were very close in age, so that also made for a bit of a weird, awkward dynamic for me. But I had seen him for about 3 or 4 sessions. It was a sliding scale, so I was paying him for like $12 a session. And then he told me, well, the program's ending. I won't be able to provide services to you anymore. And I thought, okay, well, that's fine. But I liked the idea of being able to talk with someone who wasn't judging me, who wasn't trying to give me a solution at every corner, but allowing me the space to be vulnerable and to give myself grace. And that was something that was very, very new for me at the time. So I had sought therapy with the mental health department with my insurance, and I started with a counselor and realized I have to spill my whole entire story and what I've been going through all over again. I did it, and maybe the second or third session, I was told that she was moving and would no longer be able to provide services to me again. And if you have had any experience changing therapists, then you understand how frustrating and how heartbreaking that is, to have to be vulnerable and learn to trust someone new all over again. So finally, I was assigned a new therapist, and this therapist is my current therapist, which I am very grateful I still have. And I have been working with her for about 4 years now. I also had been seeing a psychiatrist and had started several drugs to help with my anxiety and depression, which I am hoping to kind of talk about in another video, because that whole journey was a whole mountain in and of itself. Definitely had taken some time for me to get acquainted with my therapist, my current therapist. She knows me pretty well at this point. I see her regularly. At the time, we were seeing each other in person, and I didn't know what to expect. But what really pulled me in was that every person there at the mental health department was so kind, understanding, and so validating. And it was like, for the first time in my life, I was feeling heard, and I wasn't being shut down for how I was feeling, for being too emotional. And it took a lot of courage, because having to spill the beans to someone you don't know requires vulnerability, and being vulnerable requires a lot of courage, and I didn't feel it at the time that I was being brave. It definitely didn't feel like that. But, in learning to give myself grace and be kind to myself, I later realized that it is. Being able to be vulnerable is a strength. And since seeing my therapist, it has changed my life. There's something about the power of the diagnosis and realizing and finding the words that described what was afflicting me. What was this invisible force that I had created my entire life around dealing with, and that there were things that I can do to live with it. And then it wasn't simply just a matter of this is something that's wrong with me that I just have to live with for the rest of my life. It's something that I can find tools for and learn to live with. One of the wonderful things about therapy is, one, feeling validated, feeling heard. Of course, sometimes it might take a few tries to find the right fit and find a counselor that works for your certain style and needs. But on top of that, learning about the science behind my anxiety and depression made a world of a difference for me. Because as emotional and I'm a big follower of the heart, if that makes any sense. Despite that, I was still very, very rational minded. And so when I started to unravel the anxious brain and understand how it functions in the past and in the future versus the present, and thus how meditation helps one to ground themselves within the present and therefore can help to counteract the anxious brain, and all of these other tools that we can do to reel it in, and the different lobes, and how anxiety is not working, is not engaging the frontal lobe where we make all these executive and rational decisions and logical decisions. It's very emotion based. Like, things would start to come together, and suddenly it made more sense, and suddenly I felt validated by the science, and I wouldn't have come to those understandings without my therapist explaining them to me. And so it was very useful because I received a lot of tools to cope with my panic attacks, tools to observe what was happening, what was triggering them, the opportunities to unpack childhood traumas and day-to-day things. My therapist was with me when I decided that I needed to get out of my last relationship, and it often felt like the end of the world, and I wasn't sure if I was making the right decision, but it was a learning experience that really benefited from having someone on the outside talk me through everything. So anxiety is still a very big part of my day-to-day life. I still often have panic attacks when I least expect them. There's still trauma and emotions and memories that I am working to unpack. There are still drugs that I am exploring and changes in lifestyle that I am exploring. And I recognize that I am not going to ever be rid completely of my anxiety. But the person that I've become since that whole journey, and the person that I never thought I would be as a child growing up with resting sad face, is slowly coming to fruition and revealing herself more and more. And that wouldn't have happened had I not initiated this journey of asking for help and accepting it and giving myself grace and giving myself room to grow and explore parts of myself that I had always thought were not feasible because of my anxiety. And so I hope that you will continue to join me in these tea talks and listen to me rant about my own experiences. And I recognize that they may not be extremely eloquent because I'm anxious as I am recording myself here and now. It's freezing in here, but I don't have my sweater. I took my sweater off because I was sweating because I was anxious. I'm very passionate about sharing my experience with other people who may be in the same place that I was a few years ago when I had no idea what was happening, when I was afraid to get support. And I hope that this can resonate with you. And I'd very appreciate you tuning in. Till next time.